Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Ian Campbell. I'm Vice President of Operations at PACICC, and I'm also your moderator for today's webinar. This is the first of 3 Emerging Risks webinars that we're hosting in 2018. Today we're looking at risk issues related to climate change and the implications this will have for P&C insurance in Canada. I'm joined by our guest speaker here, Paul Kovacs. Welcome, Paul. Paul is the President and CEO of PACICC, and he's also founder and Executive Director of the Institute for Catastrophic Loss Reduction. So we have him doing double duty today. I'm going to circle back in a second and introduce Paul more formally, but I have some housekeeping issues to look after and some background points. These webinars, we use them to drill deeper into topical issues that have caught the attention of risk management professionals right across the industry. Our webinars connect interested parties right across Canada, and these are parties that might not otherwise be available to attend some of our forum meetings in Toronto, so it's very convenient. Interest in our webinar series continues to grow. We have senior risk officers from 35 organizations joining us here today and more than 100 individuals online, so welcome everybody. And a special welcome if this is the first time you're participating in one of our webinars. You'll notice this is a new format. We usually have static slides and voiceovers and pictures of us, but we thought we'll try something different. This will be interactive conversation in a sit-down format. We're coming to you live from the offices of PACICC and ICLR. We're right in the middle of a functioning office, and if you do hear phones or printers, do bear with us, but we thought it'd be kind of fun to do it right in the center of the office. We're not going to be taking questions with today's broadcast. You had an opportunity to submit your questions ahead of time, and I thank you. We received a wealth of questions, and you'll see those factored into today's presentation. So thank you, everybody who supplied questions to me. I feel armed and ready and very excited about today's broadcast. I can tell you my kids at home are very excited because they think Dad's got his own talk show now. So if things go very well, I was joking with Paul earlier, I'm going to ask him for money for an office band, but we'll see how that goes. I do have an antitrust compliance observation I have to look after here. We're bound by the Competition Act. The purpose of our webinars is not to collude on approaches to any business strategies. The commentary will not reveal directly or indirectly individual claims adjusting practices, approaches to scopes of coverage or resolving mixed claims, or practices in managing third-party vendors and service providers. Our webinars are recorded. You're going to find them available on our website for future on-demand rebroadcast. We have copies of past webinars available you will find of interest, and that should be available early next week. This will be of interest to members who are not able to join us online today, but can see this broadcast later on. As I mentioned, our guest speaker is Paul Kovacs. Paul is the President and CEO of PACICC and also the founder and Executive Director of ICLR, which is located on the campus of Western University. Since 1996, Paul's been a contributing author to the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. This is the world's leading forum for the study of climate issues. The panel won the 2007 Nobel Peace Prize, we'll talk about that a little bit later, for their efforts to build up and disseminate greater knowledge about man-made climate change. Paul is Canada's leading authority on insurance and climate change. He's a contributing author to numerous international and Canadian reports on reducing the risk of loss from earthquakes, flood, and severe wind. For more than 35 years, he's been a popular commentator on insurance, disaster safety, and economic policy. He's written more than 200 publications and articles. Paul's a passionate champion for insurance, disaster resilience, and adaptation to climate extremes. He's worked in private industry, the public sector, and academia. Paul is co-chair of the Infrastructure and Housing Working Group of Canada's Adaptation Platform, and he's also co-chair of the Science and Technology Working Group of Canada's Platform on Disaster Risk Reduction. He's a member of numerous boards and advisory panels, and you'll see he has a very impressive collection of bow ties. This is one of many. I didn't phone Paul this morning. Please don't think that everybody at PACICC wears suits and gray suits and bow ties. Not the case. It's not a requirement to wear a bow tie if you work at PACICC, but we are trying to convert our colleagues here in the office to wear bow ties instead of long ties. Anyways, okay, let's get in. I have a series of questions to throw at Paul, and this will help guide our discussion. So let's begin high level. We have 35 member companies represented online today. They're joining us here right across Canada. Not everyone is familiar with the work of ICLR. Perhaps we can begin by having you provide a brief overview of the Institute, its history, the ongoing work, and related matters.
Ian, thank you for the opportunity. I look forward to chatting with you about climate change and what it means for the industry. In my opinion, climate change is one of the most profound issues confronting society, this generation and next, and confronting people working in the Canadian insurance industry. So a very topical issue, and great to spend some time together to talk about it. A little over 25 years ago, Hurricane Andrew struck in Florida and had a very disruptive impact on the Florida insurance market. A number of companies failed, and the industry struggled to figure out how to respond to a large hurricane. And it was a wake-up call for Canadian insurance and others. I was brought in to get involved in a Canadian dialogue about how our industry could better understand risks associated with extreme events. And there were a number of policy issues that I was involved in at the time working for the Insurance Bureau. But one of the key findings of that exercise was that the Canadian insurance industry was not, at that time, connecting into the science community in Canada. The knowledge that was available was not being brought into the industry to the extent that we thought we should. And so the decision was made a little over 20 years ago to set up the Institute for Catastrophic Loss Reduction, put it at Western University, and have a formal long-term process so that the Canadian insurers could better understand the science about earthquakes, flooding, extreme weather, understand and be able to communicate what we can learn about those different risks and how to manage them better.
And how many companies, members of PACICC, support the work of ICLR?
So the 20 largest insurers are all members of ICLR, and about 90% of the industry. So again, most of the mid-sized and smaller companies are also in, but all of the large companies right across the country are part of the Institute, including some public insurers, all the private insurers, et cetera, are in the family.
And there's no limit on membership? Other organizations can get involved if they...
Yeah, all insurers are welcome, and it's a great forum to get together, talk to the science community, talk to colleagues about what do we know, what do we want to learn about the risk. And a particular focus of our effort is how can we learn to live with flooding and shaking of the ground and fires in the forest and not expect as much damage? How can we focus on risk reduction? What are the best practices? What's the science say? How can we learn that and communicate that to others?
Okay. Paul's one of the most well-traveled individuals I know. He's a member of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. This is a scientific and intergovernmental body operating under the auspices of the United Nations. So Paul, maybe you could take a few moments and tell us about the work of the panel and what are its key objectives.
A little over 20 years ago, the Government of Canada put my name forward to the United Nations, and I was one of a number of scientists chosen to be part of the panel. I think there's probably 2,000 of us altogether, so it's a large group of people. And our responsibility is to stay abreast of the current knowledge. What does the science community say about climate change? And regularly we put out reports to try to assess and synthesize what this body of research is presently saying. So when I got involved 22 years ago, at that time there was a lot of words we were using, like we think something's happening, but we're not sure, and there was a lot of uncertainty in what we were sharing in our writing. But as time has evolved and as research has become deeper and more conclusive, as there's been more evidence, as the climate has continued to evolve, the words that we have been putting out have been just increasingly aggressive. And the most recent language we're using is that the evidence is overwhelming, it's incontrovertible, that there's clear evidence that the behavior of us as humans in terms of how we're using fossil fuels is really changing the climate. And for the insurance industry in Canada, one of the outcomes is that the kind of extreme events that lead to damage and loss, those sorts of events frequently are happening with greater frequency and greater severity.
It must be frustrating for you, just the number of people that doubt climate change, that it is a real phenomenon, that some people will look at this as a younger person issue and maybe an urban issue. Do you see that in your work?
The evidence on climate change from a science perspective is simply overwhelming, and that there is very, very strong, consistent findings, one study after another, about there is something very profound happening. We are relatively early in this process. Most of the measurable changes happened since the 1970s, so this is a period where it's just become large enough that we can truly measure and demonstrate to anybody who might be a little bit skeptical. But not only is the science community very strongly unified in terms of its view of what the evidence shows, most of the polling data and whatever shows that there's, again, a very strong sense amongst most of the public. There just happens to be a group that are fairly accessible to the media and promoted by the media that talk about skepticism, and the media seem to give them more playtime than the science would suggest they have earned. But there are challenges in terms of once you get through the discussion about is the climate changing, and you come to the conclusion, absolutely, where there still remains a challenge for the insurance industry and others who want to act upon the overwhelming evidence that the climate is changing. Specifically, what does that mean? How quickly is it happening? How soon will it happen? What are the specifics that will occur in a particular location and affect a particular kind of risk? And that's where we are gaining more specific results, but there is still uncertainty about the specific change, how quickly it'll happen, and what it'll mean.
It's not coming across as selfish for the insurance industry that it's deemed to be, it's affecting our costs, therefore we have to do something about this. You're finding there's broad support?
Some of the writing I've been doing, this is a chance to look across industries and try to look at how different industries have taken this single global phenomena of the climate changing with very large local variation in terms of what's happening in this location. But how have different industries reacted? And the insurance industry should be very proud. It was one of the industries that was one of the first to start talking about the evidence that the insurance data and practices were starting to show, saying we're seeing this early. And the insurance industry is further along in terms of demonstrating actual action to deal with climate change. This is in terms of changing its own practices. You have an industry illustrating a few examples. On the underwriting side, this long history of using actuarial historic pricing to determine how to properly accept and price risks, and now bringing in models and tools that are accepted as normal for the industry. These kinds of things didn't exist 20 odd years ago. Climate model type tools that are now more commonplace used in insurance are just starting to be talked about by bankers, by other industries that are affected greatly by insurance, the utilities, et cetera. And so the tools that we've pioneered and we've brought in are starting to spread and get into other sectors. The industry has been more active in the public policy realm, going to governments saying, we are seeing our own costs change over time, and there's a need to change how the governments are managing risks and taking care of infrastructure and other things that are government responsibility, but the insurance industry challenged them to think about the losses that are taking place. And so the industry has been in a fairly unique position that I don't think is seen as self-serving. This is the industry doing its job to protect its policyholders and its customers and communicate what's being experienced by insurance companies, which is a large increase of disaster damage. One part of the understanding about why disaster damage paid by insurance has increased is change in the climate that has already started.
You've been at this for a long time. Do you personally, for me, it caught my attention in the 90s with the ice storm we've got some serious issues. Is there a trigger, is there a launch point where all of a sudden you feel like the public got it? Now they're bought into this. Is it kind of organic? Yeah. It's grown over time?
So I've had the good fortune of being involved in participating in most of the large Canadian events that have occurred over the last 20, 25 years. But also it's been part of my responsibility looking at some of the big international events. And there was the very large loss of life when there was extreme heat in Europe, and particularly in France. And that was a large wake-up call that occurred in Europe, where this general discussion about climate change is a bad thing, and it's not something that people want to have happen, but it now turned into there are people in Europe dying, and it was just a very different discussion after that event in Europe. In North America, Andrew was an early issue for our insurance industry, but a little bit after that, we had a series of hurricanes like Katrina and Rita and some other large events that I think were large catalysts in the North American discussion. And sometimes our Canadian issues are formed a little bit based on what happens in the U.S. I do share with you, I think the ice storm was a reminder to Canada that we can have large events here as well. But the flooding that occurred in Calgary, and then a few weeks later, the flooding that occurred in Mississauga, was taking our most common weather-related issue, flooding, but saying, look, the scale is way bigger than we've ever experienced before, and sort of mobilized opinion for a number of people in parts of Alberta and parts of Ontario saying, hey, this is really affecting us directly. And then a really important one again was the wildfire in Fort McMurray, and just the scale and the national attention focused on the 100,000 people being told that they must leave their homes, and unprecedented damage in terms of destruction. So in Canada, it's part of this global view where these large events I think are quite important. I think in Europe and the United States there were some even larger events than we've had in Canada, and they really do change public opinion.
So reflecting on the work of the panel, do you think, what political and economic impacts do you think the panel is having? So in politics, are you bringing in countries that you might not otherwise think this would be on their radar? And in terms of economic impacts, or governments giving money to initiatives to combat climate change, what are you seeing both politically and economically?
So I've chosen to be a volunteer helping the UN work on the climate change issues through the work of the panel, and kept that up for more than 20 years because I think it's really important and I think it's having a positive impact. A challenge that I've had is that when we started this project, the global discussion about climate change, it was segmented into two big areas right out of the bat. So one on mitigation, one on adaptation. So the international discussion supported by the panel on the science side and with a large political process around it, on the mitigation side, the focus there was how can we not emit, not use as much coal and oil and gas and other fossil fuels, because the scientific evidence was just so overwhelming that our behavior over the last few decades in terms of the use of fossil fuels was just bringing dangerous change to our climate. So there's this large science around what are our choices, what are our options to try to reduce or completely eliminate the use of various fossil fuels in the future. I haven't been part of that group, but that group has had more of the publicity, more of the political attention has been on how to come up with a long-term international strategy to reduce the amount of carbon that we produce. The part that I've been more involved in is the focus on adaptation. And whatever decisions and choices are made in terms of the emissions of greenhouse gases, the climate has been changing and is going to keep changing. And so how do we adapt and make sure that we learn to cope with the kind of weather and the increasingly dangerous weather that we're going to see over time has been my passion and my interest. And it's been a really good fit for insurance because the experience and the knowledge within the insurance industry fits right in and said, well, if you build this way, then you have less damage than if you build that way. And let's quantify it. The amount of difference is this amount, and that's less than the cost of doing it. So you save 6 times what you spend. Or there's a variety of different ways that it has been very rewarding to be able to work on the issues around how to adapt and how to bring knowledge and science to the discussion about adaptation, how to involve the insurance industry. The challenge is that that part of the dialogue hasn't had quite the same attention, and that's been a little frustrating for some of us. And a lot more has been on the very problematic and important challenge of how to do both, but how to reduce the emissions.
Okay. You've authored a number of articles for the panel. Can you tell us about some of your work here, the chapters of major publications and how you fit as a small cog in a big wheel for the reports that the panel is producing?
Yeah, when we put out our reports, they're really big, and some of us read them from cover to cover, but there's a lot of people who just can't read through something that long.
Amazing thump factor.
Yeah, and so folks zoom right in. Most of my work is focused on what's happening in Canada and the United States, and again, the issues that are evident in places like Africa and Southeast Asia are of a different scale. Some of these places have no building codes and people living in great poverty and all kinds of challenges that shape the overall context of how to deal with issues like climate change. But across Canada and the United States, there's a little bit more consistency in terms of the way we approach the issues and some of the tools and options and evidence that we're able to bring to the table. And certainly the very important role of insurance has been part of the areas that I've been asked to write about. Besides focusing more on North America in my contribution to the international effort, I've been invited to talk more about extreme events. Climate change shows up in a variety of different ways, and it can be this slow increase of the height of the oceans. It can be permafrost melting gradually over decades. But the kinds of issues that I've been focusing on are these extreme events like a hurricane, a tornado, extreme rain on the city leading to flooding. And in each of these areas, it's been quite exciting over 20 odd years to see how the knowledge and issues have changed. One of the specific challenges that I was part of was, it was my job for the UN to write up about Katrina striking and what that meant in terms of the evidence. And the story that I wrote in the first draft was that even a very successful country like the United States, with all of its resources and funds and whatever, was unable to handle an event of the size of Katrina. And the process the UN uses is that we are to write about the science and document what we have found from the written literature. But before it becomes a public document, it's edited by the governments involved. So after I wrote about the shortcomings of what the American government did with respect to Katrina, I was sitting back waiting, well, I wonder what they're going to say about what I wrote before it's time to go out. And I was pleasantly surprised when it came back and they said, you weren't strong enough and you have to put even stronger messages that we really didn't do well, and be more specific and push harder to say we missed on this point and we missed on that point. And so the UN process has been very satisfying, but it's very challenging because you have to get all of these nuances through. And at the end of the day, everything we write is not only scientifically rigorous, but it also has to go through this political process. So,
And do you find, you said your study of Canada, the extreme events across Canada, I mean, you name a province and probably it's more subject to a certain extreme event, like, for example, Manitoba with flooding. Will it always be that way, or will there be other events, extreme events? Calgary, I hear hail and earthquake in BC and things like that. Are we seeing a mix across Canada? Is that changing, or is it always going to be that way for extreme events?
So one of the reasons why the discussion about climate change, in my opinion, was struggling for a while, and I think is now actively moving forward in a very exciting way, in a much more enthusiastic way than it did 20 odd years ago, is that there was an initial focus on climate change as opposed to a focus today on climate or severe weather. So climate change, part of the discussion was, well, what's different? And is that difference clear enough and evident enough? And the science community would come back and often say, well, we're not quite sure if it's really happening more often. And what do you do about the incremental side? As the discussion started to move and it said, okay, we have a lot of hail in Ontario and the prairies. We have a lot of flooding in urban centers. We have hurricanes that could strike in the eastern part of Canada. So a climate focus rather than the climate change focus not only takes on the change and the new risks that are coming, but also the existing risks. And so when we're able to turn to the science and say, how do you deal with an increase in extreme rainfall in urban centers and also extreme rainfall in urban center, both change, but the existing climate underwriting. And it's, well, if we put in backwater valves, and if we increase the diameter of the sewer pipes, and
Makes
a
sense.
variety of things that can be dealt with that deal with the existing issues and also the change that is coming. Suddenly you start to move to action. And for me, it has been really exciting, and the discussion in Canada varies, and it's quite different. In Atlantic Canada, we deal with issues like hurricanes, and you don't have to deal with hurricanes in Regina. But in Regina, you have to deal with hail, and you have to deal with tornadoes and urban flooding. And so being able to look across a number of different hazards has been really exciting to me. And part of the UN process, bringing different scientists together. Some scientists are very specialized in just one area. And part of the Canadian role that the insurance industry has funded through the Institute of Catastrophic Loss Reduction has looked across several different hazards. And so we're able to contribute on several fronts, and contribute also in the way that some of the things we know about how to reduce flood risk can be applied to reducing wildfire risk. So by looking across, we've been able to uniquely help across the country and help across hazards.
And so it's raised Canada's profile in terms of this being of interest around the world, that it's with ICLR, we can't afford not to be funding an institute like that, a research institute.
For me, it's really exciting to go to some of the international discussions, and in those, Canada has been aggressively criticized for our failure to do much about reducing emissions. We emit a lot per person, and we have been increasing our emissions per person, much more so than people in Europe and a lot of other places. So the global discussion about climate change and the great focus on those issues around emissions has often had us in a position where we were being criticized by others who were making more progress. And just the last couple of years, that viewpoint has changed, and Canada's showing a new leadership role on emissions reduction. But while we were often being criticized and the media played up some of that negative commentary about what Canada was doing, for me it was exciting on the area that we happen to be involved in with the Institute and my own work, and the insurance work in Canada, was on how to adapt and how to cope with the change that's happening. And Canadians and the insurance industry and the Institute and such, I was always very proud to represent what we were contributing and what we were saying, because in that space, we are seen as leaders, and we're doing a lot. Mm-hmm. And specifically on the issue of climate change and insurance, the Institute for Catastrophic Loss Reduction has been in place for more than 20 years because the Canadian insurers had the foresight to say, we want to understand these issues, and we want to invest in the science, and we want this information to be available. And we made a number of those choices to set up a group more than 20 years ago. And you look around the world, and the dialogue that's taking place, many of the people I meet, they say, oh, I've been doing this for 3 years, or I've been doing this for 3.5 years. They're still counting in months for some of these folks. And for our work, we started early. We are much further along. We have a lot to contribute in the areas where we're contributing. And so it's very exciting for me to be able to proudly represent the industry and others.
You're a member of the panel, and we talked earlier about there's a number of people on the panel, but that said, you're still a recipient of the Nobel Peace Prize. That's a pretty cool thing. That must have been a big honor for your family.
Yeah, it was really huge. The prize was awarded to the United Nations, or to the team, and the prize includes money, so the United Nations enjoyed getting the money, which was great. I got a plaque, so hanging on the wall.
It's quite impressive.
It's very nice to have a plaque. And I happen to be in Stockholm, and I get to go into the Nobel Prize Museum.
Oh, wow.
I got in for free because,
wow.
because we were part of
Better than a
part of the
discount.
panel. There you go. So, but the work has been a real honor, and it's very exciting that the industry has provided the support and the energy to allow the Institute and myself to be involved in leading edge research that the world wants to know about, and that the Government of Canada chose to put my name forward to be a volunteer. And as a volunteer, as all of us are, we all do volunteer work here. It's tough on the family because you're away trying to help write these different documents, and having a few hundred people write a report together is not an easy thing to do. Right. But we have found a process to allow that. So it's a real honor, but it's really hard work. There's a demand for excellence, and it has to be the highest quality of research before it goes through that process. So it's very challenging and as I said, demanding, but quite exciting, quite rewarding.
Intellectually stimulating and also very rewarding. Something you mentioned earlier about climate change, you said there's lots of articles published, some dealing with mitigation and some adaptation. So can you tell us the difference between the two? And why are some bodies, for example, the panel, why are some focused on adaptation and not everybody on mitigation? Let's stop these problems if that's possible. Is it possible?
Yeah, climate change science is very complicated, and there are now a very large number of people around the world who are looking at different aspects and specialize in particular areas. It has proven to be useful for the decision-making community to generalize that into two broad categories. And there's the one group of scientists who've been looking at the issues around the evidence that 150 years ago we were not burning coal and oil and gas, and today we are burning an awful lot of coal and oil and gas. And as those emissions got into the atmosphere, that has contributed to a change that's already evident in the climate and a change that is further change that's anticipated in the years ahead. And the core for how society over an extended period of a few generations manage climate change starts with how do we manage the emissions of greenhouse gases. And once you put something in the air, it's up there for 100 years. So, you know, there's a lot of momentum in the system. Even if we stop this afternoon, the climate will continue to change for a period of time because of what's already been emitted.
Yeah.
But how do we change our society so that we manage what's going forward will have a huge impact over time. And that has brought a group of scientists together. What are the alternative ways to do that? There's talk about a tax on carbon. There's talk about trading emission opportunities. You pay for the rights. There are alternative technologies that can be brought in to capture some of the emissions as they come out the smokestack or whatever. Use cleaner fuels in the process. Use solar. Use wind power. There's a whole science that is very complicated and brings together literally thousands of people around the world to think about the science, the policy choices, the economic incentives, the various issues related to how we got to the situation we are now and how we might manage that going forward to get off a dangerous path and to get onto a safer path. So that's been one group of science, and that's given the overall term mitigation within the climate language being used. But the other group of science, the one that I've been involved in, has been adaptation. And this is acknowledging that the weather patterns being experienced in Canada and elsewhere today are simply different than they were a generation ago in complicated ways, but the weather has changed. And that all the evidence is further change is coming. And so how do we now change our practices to reflect the fact that the weather has changed and more change is coming? What specific things do we do? And this is into how we build houses, how we build our infrastructure, how all of our practices take place. And the scale and the scope of the change taking place, this is just very challenging. And so again, the number of scientists involved, the number of people looking at the policy analysis and the incentives and the other opportunities to change how we behave, the building codes, the standards, the many choices that we make. There are many different people who come into that part of the dialogue. And so the overall climate research community is large and multidimensional, but it has proven to be a useful differentiation to talk about those working on reducing greenhouse gas emissions and those trying to focus on how we adapt society to better cope with the change that is coming to the weather.
Mm-hmm. Okay. You're a guy who walks the talk. You're one of the first guys I know that owned an electric vehicle. Do you see it? You're a young guy too. Do you see it in your lifetime that we're going to tip towards electric vehicles and away from fossil fuel?
Yeah, I'm definitely one of the glass half full people.
Okay.
So climate change is a profound issue, and it is having and will have a really big impact on society. And part of that impact will be a number of negatives, like more storms with large impacts that do damage. So there are a lot of consequences that were not anticipated when we moved to carbon-based systems that we have in place now. But I also am convinced that the incentives in place and the technology becoming available are in the process of moving us away from the bad practices toward better practices. So the use of solar electric generation, wind-powered electric generation, the technology is better understood, the costs are coming down remarkably, the knowledge about how to build and design a home so that the home can cope with the kind of weather that we anticipate in the future instead of designing it for the weather we used to have in the past, which is what our current codes and standards require. We are building in these processes so that we will build better structures, better homes, better buildings, better infrastructure. And all of those processes, I can see them coming, and so I'm very optimistic about the direction we're going. The unanswerable question, in my opinion, at this point in time, is the positive changes we are taking place and the big, overwhelming challenges that climate change brings. Which one will come first? Will we do it in time? We're doing the right things and we're on the right path, but the challenges are just getting greater every year as the weather has changed. And so I hope we can pick up the pace and we do the good things we're doing a little sooner and a little more aggressively.
So reflecting back over the past number of decades, would you say we've had 2 really good decades of progress? Would you say it's 3 or 4? Can you put a time period?
So one issue is the politics of all of this, and the United Nations have a global process, and under that global process, we started with a meeting in Rio more than 25 years ago and had leaders. At that time, Canada was represented by Brian Mulroney, so get a sense of how far back in time it was. Mm-hmm. But the leaders from around the world came together, and 190 odd countries all signed a global agreement more than 25 years ago saying, we see evidence that the weather's going to change and we should do all we can to stop bad change from occurring. Now, since that time, we've tried to work out the details, exactly what is it we want to do. At the high level, there was a very strong consensus that's largely held up for a long period of time, that climate change is a very profound and large issue. I see that the agreement that took place in Paris in 2015 was a very strong agreement and came a long way, and got a large number of the important emitters for that meeting. The United States and China and some other groups all agreed to the same plan for what we want to do initially. And the fact that the United States has stepped back a little bit since the Paris Agreement, still there's a lot of momentum around a plan of what we do. Mm-hmm. A challenge is that the Paris plan was not enough. It was the next step of what we need to do. And instead of talking about how to keep America in the fold and some other challenges around the Paris Agreement, the hope was now we'd be talking about how you do something that goes beyond the Paris Agreement to go the rest of the way. The other part that has really excited me in terms of strong evidence that the world is changing is that the media focus on what the government leaders are saying and what the government leaders are able or unable to agree to. In the meantime, the private sector has simply charged forward. There's some, like the insurance industry, that have been actively dealing with these issues and getting on with sorting out their own companies and what they need to do in terms of how to make sure that they're covering what they mean to cover and they have the funds available to pay all the claims. The industry is comfortable dealing with the climate risk that it's taken on, and the progress that I have seen within the insurance industry to be even more confident in that. But it's the private sector consensus about action has gone well beyond insurance. And there's meetings like the January meeting every year of the World Economic Forum And for several years running, including earlier this year, the world leaders came together and they said, once again, the most important issues facing private industry right now and society right now are extreme weather and climate change. And that we, mainly private sector leaders, we believe this is where the focus needs to be, that real action in our companies, in our political system is really needed. Having the private sector being far more unified and outspoken, maybe a bit more evident in Europe than it is in the United States and some others within the private sector, but this is, again, very strong direction that climate change must be addressed coming from private industry, accepted by the public and accepted by our elected leaders. So I certainly see over the last 20-odd years a real sense that we understand this is an issue and we're really trying to do something about it. Will we do it in time is the question that we won't have an answer to for a while, but I choose to be optimistic.
Good. You talked about ICLR and the focus on climate adaptation. I've also heard this referred to as disaster risk reduction. Is there a difference? It's not mitigation. Mitigation is essentially eliminating, stopping the problem. So disaster risk reduction, is that a fanciful way of talking about how we adapt to changing climates?
So within the policy world, so in terms of government policy, and some of the way we choose to frame issues and talk about issues, there are two worlds that are completely overlapped and certainly embrace the insurance community, but largely have found a way to not talk to each other, which drives some of us crazy. So within the Canadian policy community, within the United Nations policy community, there's one group that focus on climate change, and we've spent most of our time today talking about that. Mm-hmm. There's another group who talk about disaster management. And within the climate community, one part of that is extreme events, extreme weather events. Within the disaster community, we're talking about the same extreme weather events. And part of the climate discussion is how do we adapt so that those kinds of very strong events don't do as much damage. Well, that's what the disaster community are talking about as well. And to my surprise, the policymakers in both communities don't talk to each other as much as they should. They're both working on the same issues, and they're within the same United Nations or Canadian or provincial entity. But they're in different parts of the building, and they surprisingly don't talk to each other very much. And the science community that are trying to help inform and support good decision-making by policymakers and by private industry. Again, we have often two different science communities. The Institute for Catastrophic Loss Reduction actually started within the disaster management community, and we were invited to contribute to the climate change work. But our roots are, and our core work is in the disaster management community. That's what the Institute does, and our science is committed to trying to better understand these risks. So the same year that the Paris Agreement got a great deal of international publicity and Canadian publicity as the new international climate change approach that the new government in Canada is committed to, and most of the world governments have committed to the Paris Accord. There was a second agreement the same year that the UN accomplished, and it was done in Japan, called the Sendai Framework, and it was the global strategy on disaster management. And we had different people go to the meeting in Sendai, Japan, then went to the meeting in Paris. But we talked about all the same issues and developed a slightly different strategy that is not in conflict, but it's organized differently. And I happen to be representing the Government of Canada, or part of the Canadian group in Sendai, and had a chance to represent the science community in Sendai. And also helped to do some of the background writing for the Sendai Agreement.
How big? 200 people to attend an event like that?
So the one in Sendai, I think we had 5,000. And
Wow.
When the Paris meeting was had, I thought I heard there were 20,000 people at that.
Wow.
And one of our colleagues here from the Institute was there. And so this is an industry that has popped up. And yeah, it's quite remarkable. How do you actually take out of that chaos, come up with agreement? And for those of us who are working behind the scenes, one of the ways that we got an agreement out of Sendai was a few of us were working on it for 2 years before the meeting, and so when you finally have the meeting and it was in pretty good shape before the meeting.
That's impressive. We've had a lot of rain here in Toronto in the last 24 hours. We're a city that complains about everything. Precipitation's on a lot of people's minds right now. Do you find precipitation changing in Canada? Are we now subject to heavier rainfalls, heavier extreme events related to precipitation?
So the one part that's unambiguous is that the damage from heavy precipitation in urban centers has increased remarkably. And so there is overwhelming evidence coming from insurance data, coming from also the public data for those who are not with insurance, that the damage from extreme rainfall happening in urban centers has increased a great deal, in particular basement flooding and those sorts of issues. One of the challenges is to look at why. What are the root causes? Why do we have so much more damage? And the science is suggesting to us, to me, is that climate change will, over time, be the overwhelming reason. There is a sense with the warmer world, we will have more extreme rainfall events that will also include falling in urban areas. So we will have an increase in the frequency and severity of extreme rainfall events over time, and that a generation from now, 2 generations from now, we will have much more of these extreme rain events that overwhelm infrastructure in urban areas unless we change the infrastructure in urban areas over that period of time. But if we continue to do current practices, we will have more losses because there are more events. In terms of the losses that have already increased, and explaining why have they already increased, there's much more complexity. I do not accept that it would be right to say all of the increase to date was because of climate change. We have a lot more people with finished basements. We have a lot of infrastructure that has been allowed to get old and not be maintained and is breaking down, not because necessarily the extent of the rainfall, but because it's old and it's not been taken care of. A variety of conflicting factors has definitely overwhelmed the system and led to loss. And one part of that is that there has been some change in the climate. But looking ahead, the change in the climate leading to more extreme rain happening in urban centers will become the dominant issue for the next generation, 2 generations, unless we change how we manage these issues.
The frequency and severity of events becoming more costly to the P&C insurance industry. The costs have been doubling. I was hearing doubling every 10 years, essentially, since the 90s, is that?
Yeah, so there is strong national data for Canada, international data coming out of information collected by Munich Reinsurance, Swiss Reinsurance, showing pretty consistently from country to country across a lot of different hazards, these long-term trends that are, again, just reminding the insurance industry and broader groups that this is not something that is just the last decade or 5 years or something. This is not something that just has come up. This has been creeping up over a fairly extended period of time. And we're fairly confident in the data, perhaps back to the early 1980s, that it's been collected in a fairly consistent way, that the role and the amount of insurance coverage in places like Canada has been fairly consistent over that period of time. There are some databases that try to go back further in time, but it's hard to fully understand the data. And what does it mean to look at 100 years of data and what's been going on? But I think certainly going back at least to the early 1980s up until the present, we're seeing for Canada and others this doubling of losses happening again and then again and then again.
So it's difficult to tease out climate change and the costs of that. Some people would have you believe that we're the cause of our own problems right now, that we've got more stuff. The growth in assets, you talked about finishing your basement and putting that in harm's way, and urbanization, the fact that we're building now on the fringes of floodplains and we're going back there, communities get wiped out, and they go right back and they rebuild. So are we not, would you say that doubters here would say it's the same climate, it's just you're antagonizing the situation, you're coming with more stuff, you're putting that in harm's way, you're the cause of your own problems. How would you respond to that?
So the agreement on disaster management that the UN came to in Sendai in 2015 The core of the background work some of us are involved in was why. What are the root causes about why losses are so much higher now than they were a generation ago? And there has been no one challenged that losses have increased, because they have. There's no one questioning that. What they are questioning in some of the debate going on is, what is the reason for it? And again, the research is hard. It's not easy to tease all of these things out. If you step back to the global level, one of the research challenges that we put out there was that there's a sense in the science community that we have a lot more knowledge. Every year we learn more things. So shouldn't we be able to get losses down because we have more knowledge about loss risk reduction? And so there was an initial academic focus to say, we know how to reduce these losses, we're not doing it. The problem is the politicians failing to implement our good ideas. But as that issue has been explored, there's a lot of evidence that there are countries around the world who are actually doing these things. These suggestions come out of the research community, actual changes in behavior, expenditures that the governments are trying and are making progress, and there's a fairly large collection of evidence. There's some ambiguity around that, but it's an interesting policy question. So the focus is increasingly focused in the last little while on the issue of the choices being made by society about where we live. And we're having a lot more people live in risky areas. And so you see this image of the Florida coast 50 or 100 years ago, and it was a beautiful beach, and now it's all these buildings with this great view of the next hurricane, but they're just sitting there right in harm's way. And you generalize that. The community in Canada with a large hazard risk is Vancouver. Besides climate risk, they have a large earthquake risk in Vancouver.
Some of the most expensive properties in Canada, too.
But one of the areas with the largest growth in population, et cetera, is people really want to live there, and they've moved there. The one area that has led to a really alarming change in terms of people living at risk in the United States that I fear we're about to duplicate in Canada has been related to wildfire. And the term in the research community is not wildfire, it's interface wildfire. So this is the interface between the urban center and the rural area. This interface are the areas where it's really hard to protect. We know what to do about urban fires and how to build and how to put out an urban fire without a lot of damage occurring like we had 200 years ago. Urban fire management is handled quite well. And for those who are completely in the middle of the wilderness and put a cabin up, and there's not much you can do if the fire starts. Anyway, it's challenging. The interface is where the focus has been on. And the experience in Fort McMurray and Slave Lake and Kelowna, the experience last year in California, where there's a lot of these people in the interface, and we're losing hundreds and hundreds of homes and having billions of dollars of damage. And the number of Americans who have moved from urban areas to the interface, to these vulnerable areas, without changing building practices, without changing any of the risk reduction opportunities that are known, being included in this development. We're talking about tens of millions of Americans living in risk. We've been trying to quantify that for Canada, and there are more Canadians moving to areas of risk, but we are certainly not as far along that alarming concern as the Americans. But we're going in that path, and so for some of us, we've been trying to bring forward the idea of building codes that include wildfire. The Canadian Building Code does not include wildfire right now. And so we've documented this is the specifics that should be included and taken that to the government, and we're still waiting to see. And codes for how communities should develop and how communities should be managed so that wildfire doesn't come to the fringes of the community. And a lot of that science is fairly well known, but how do you get that into standards and practices and planning decisions, et cetera? And if you fail, you end up with losses like the American losses last year for wildfire, which is just remarkable.
It seems in terms of news coverage, the homes you hear about being destroyed through wildfire are the Hollywood Hills and all the Stars homes. But we had that fire go through Fort McMurray. That was the costliest wildfire ever in Canada?
Correct. It was the most in the world until last year.
Okay, and the cost of that was? all came
again,
out
different numbers. And if you move beyond the insurance industry, there's numbers like $9 or $10 billion of damage occurred to Canada because of the fire.
So they're rebuilding right now. That's going on. Are you finding changes in building practices that now they're on the fringe of that burned out area and that will be built up again? But are they doing things differently now?
They are. And there's this broad concept being discussed in the international and the Canadian literature about Build Back Better. One of the international learnings, definitely found in the ICLR analysis and others, is that when you have experienced a really bad event, is one of the best opportunities to try to avoid making those mistakes again, and to try to make choices about where and how you build, so that the risk in the future will be less than it was. And in Fort McMurray, it's mixed. We are definitely doing some things better, and some elements of the rebuild are better than they were. But I see some opportunities that we failed to take advantage of. We commissioned work where we actually went in afterward to look at all of the homes that our industry, the insurance industry, rebuilt after the Kelowna fire, and all the homes we rebuilt after the Slave Lake fire. And we found in terms of construction practices, most of them, we put back homes that were meeting the highest of standards in terms of fire reduction. But in terms of the planting of vegetation around the homes, certainly for the Kelowna area, we were repeating all of the mistakes that brought the fire into Kelowna in the first place. And so the risk of the homes that were rebuilt burning yet again was fairly high because of the way the property was being managed. In Slave Lake, a much more positive outcome. Not only did the insurance companies put up quite strong homes that meet the higher standards in terms of fire resilience, but there was a fairly active program trying to teach people about how to manage the risk around their property. And we thought that the risk in Slave Lake was much lower now than it was when the fire hit them before. For Fort McMurray, it's a little bit early to make final judgment, but one of the reasons why the Fort McMurray damage was as bad as it was is so many of the homes up there had the vinyl siding on, and most of the new homes have vinyl siding on again. So that was an opportunity that we missed out on. But when we look at the roofs seem to be fire resilient. When we look at some of the early plantings that are happening, there seems to be a learning process about how to manage the properties around the homes that we hope will become commonplace going forward. Energy efficiency, there's a variety of things that are put into the new homes so that the new homes are better than they were. It's just there were some opportunities where we could have done even better.
There's a lot of good publications and great advice coming out of ICLR on for people to protect lives and homes and property. You produced a number of brochures. I've seen basement flooding, winter snow and ice, extreme wind. You have one coming up on hail. Are these documents that are routinely available to members out there? Can they call in and get these produced in mass quantities, provide to their customers? And what sorts of information are contained in these brochures? One
of the key messages we've had from the member insurers about what is expected from the Institute and what the members want the Institute to do. Well, the one side is to understand the science and advance the science of what is known, and do our best to communicate that back to the members. And we do that through, we had a dozen new publications last year, which is a particularly busy year for us in terms of new reports. And we do 10 webinars a year where we're presenting some new science and showing it largely to an audience of insurers, but we invite anybody else who'd like to come and learn directly from a scientist about what they've discovered from their work. But the companies not only want to learn for themselves, they are encouraging us to take the science and the knowledge and make it as broadly available as possible. So as a university-based research group, again, we don't have the capacity to go to the public other than through websites and occasional media events that we might do. But we do present, as you were sharing, some of these loss reduction documents. And we have a series of those available. And besides the loss reduction documents, we do videos to show homeowners and others how to do this. And to get that message out, we're looking for partners. And so we work with member insurers, and we welcome them to use whatever format they like. They can send it out as an ICLR advice to policyholders. They can rebrand it as something from their company, as long as the content is our content. So some companies repackage it their own way and send it out to their policyholders. We take the same information and we go to local governments, and we say to local governments, if you would like to create part of your citizen engagement efforts, advice on how to reduce risks, we'll put that all together. And so a number of communities use our material on their websites, in their mailings. And it's part of this broader sense that the insurance community is not just paying the damage after the event, but participating in reducing the risk of damage and communicating that. The consistent element across the package that we have that makes our package of materials unique from a homeowner point of view, that the government and others who sometimes do somewhat similar issues, each of our elements is written in a style that the homeowner is able to go through it and say, what is my risk? They can themselves, they don't need an expert of any sort, walk around their own house and answer some questions that we give them. And when they're done, they'll get a risk score. And if the risk score is beyond some sort of threshold, we say, you should be worried. This is too high a risk, and here's what you could do about it. Your risk, if you've had water get into your basement before, that gets one of the highest risk score because it happened before. You know, next time it could happen again. Sure. If you had it before and you've done nothing about it, you're way up there on the risk score. So now, what do you do about it? And so we can help the homeowners measure their risk of basement flooding, the risk of wildfire damage, the risk of earthquake damage, the risk of severe wind damage or winter weather damage. There's a number of different hazards that we're able to identify what the risk is. And if the risk is low, that's great. But if the risk is high, we can also tell them some basic things that can be done. So packaging that up so that member insurers can send that out and play a bigger role than just paying losses, but also inform about risk reduction and how local communities can send that out.
And so you hinted earlier the 10 webinars that you host throughout the year. I think you call them Friday Forums, and this is a chance for our community out there to get involved. So you talked about printed materials here, but this is a chance. They're very technical issues. I've sat through some of them. They're very, very technical. They drill deep, but how would they go about, some of our viewers out there, connecting to see what's coming up and what webinars would be of interest to them? Who should they contact at the Institute?
Yeah, I mean, we're excited that we get 100, 200 people sign up for these webinars, and we changed it a few years ago that these used to be meetings in a room and you sat around a table and you got that interaction with colleagues in the industry and that camaraderie. But as a national group, it was just hard for people across the country to come. So moving over to the webinar approach has helped. And so we're excited when we get 100, 200 people participate. But there's still 100,000 people work in our industry. So there's a lot of folks who are part of a member insurer and are absolutely welcome, and there's no fees. You just have to watch. We put it on our website when we say the next one is coming, and let us know. The one that just happened was we hired a scientist to update the hail maps for Canada. And our industry is often informed by things like maps. Sure. And that was on Friday of last week. And Professor Etkin shared the latest data, and we have released to the industry. Here's the likelihood of hail by specific location all across Canada. So that new mapping information is available, and the scientist, Professor Etkin, spoke with us for more than an hour talking about how he came up with the data and what came out of it. One of his findings, which was very frustrating to us, was in 2007 the government stopped keeping hail data. So don't hold your breath waiting for another update on the hail data, because there's no more data coming. And this is the latest, and I guess perhaps the last time we'll put out a hail map. And this, and he included in his data showing some fairly marked trends where the frequency of hail is changing. And so despite knowing that the hail is changing and it being a really important concern for the insurance industry, We are not going to be getting new data because the government stopped collecting the data. And that's a challenge. But that's some of the research we're trying to do to the industry, and let all of those who are interested, if they call ICLR, we'll give you the code to be able to call in for the next webinars. And that's a chance to hear directly from the scientists about the specific work they're doing, and you can interact with them to say, why did you find that, or what would you like to know?
And past webinars available through the website, is that?
Thank you. Yeah, that's one of the things we've been trying to do the last few years, is to record the webinars. Okay. So it's a chance to go back, and if there's a topic that you're really keen on, but maybe you can't make that Friday, then you can go back and go over it.
Okay. So
you can take up.
I'm jealous of my colleague here, Glenn. He's been doing this a long time, so this is my first show. So I want to get that off his band. I think that'll that'll outdo him. Attribution science. Maybe you could talk to us about that. Liability implications from extreme weather events. That, for example, Hurricane Katrina, one of the costliest, and Hurricane Harvey, costliest tropical cyclone on record, inflicting at least $125 billion in damage, primarily from catastrophic rainfall-triggered flooding in the Houston metropolitan area. So what began as a hurricane resulted in 5 days of flooding. And could you now treat those as separate events? That was a hurricane, this was overland flooding and different insurable events. Are you finding that now we're really compartmentalizing some of the after effects of extreme weather events? Is that what attribution science is all about?
So I'd be pleased to talk with you about that, because it's definitely one of the emerging areas in the research community. One of the other ones that I'd love to make sure we get a chance to talk about is what I would describe as one of the emerging issues related to disclosure, and I think that would be useful to explore. On the attribution science, the particular focus of the meteorologists and the science community has been coming up with a methodology so that they can answer the commonly brought forward question, is this big event that's occurring due to climate change? And so the science question that they are trying to be able to answer is this due to climate change? And the training for those of us involved in working on United Nations work and other work as a scientist looking at climate issues is we are always told to answer no. That maybe what you saw, like the hurricane that went through Florida and went through Houston last year, was bigger and larger damage and all that kind of stuff. And climate change says we will get more large hurricanes, but I cannot tell you that particular one was climate change. But I can tell you that we are expecting more really big ones, and watch for what's going to come. What attribution scientists are trying to do is to say, well, I think that there's a 10% part of this last one that was climate change, and that 90% is we have storms and they hit Houston from time to time, whatever. It's just the ones in the past weren't that big. And so the part that was climate change from this last storm was this portion, and able to not answer the question, the storm was entirely due to climate change. We'll be able to say part of the overall magnitude was due to climate change. And you can imagine if the extra 10% or whatever magic number could be of the strength of the hurricane or whatever the hazard is was due to climate change, well, that highest amount of extra storm can be the one that brings half of the damage. And if the whole storm had have been a proportion smaller, then the damage would have been an order of magnitude smaller, perhaps. So there's work going on right now trying to attribute climate change to damage from a particular event. This is a new science, and it's not all accepted or whatever, but it's being worked on right now. Part of your question says, well, will that lead back to liability? And that's a whole other set of steps.
Sure.
So to say this event had a part of it due to climate change, but now does that lead to this emitter using oil and gas and burning and emitting fuels led to this event being bigger than it would have been? So there's more than 1,000 different legal cases going on around the world that are being tracked by the research community, and we're trying to look at what is being brought to court in terms of liability questions, and there's many different kinds of questions that are coming to court, and how they're being resolved. And the question about was an entity, maybe someone who emitted greenhouse gases because they were an energy provider or something, has a particular emitter ever been found liable for damages that were caused by an event that could have been in part due to climate change? That has not happened yet, and there's a skepticism that liability will follow that kind of path. Where the liability question has moved further, and there is a greater expectation, part of the court behavior going on right now is that you have a number of countries who stand up and say, here's what we're doing about climate change. And you reflect and say, but you didn't do that. I mean, you said you did that, but you didn't do it.
Right.
So that's different than you caused the emissions that led to the damage from this storm. That's a question that is not being put together yet. But this other question saying, you made a commitment and you failed to follow through on your commitment, you are going to be found responsible for that. So what format that takes, and what kind of liability, and when can you hold governments liable, because that's often a political statement, sure. But that could also be someone in private industry who says, I promised to do something, and then they fail to do that, and they get challenged in court for failing to do something they promised. So there is the court system being used to hold people to commitments.
I can understand for fossil fuel manufacturers, but for governments, why holding them to account because they gave permits to build in a floodplain? What sorts of things would trigger?
Yeah, and as I said, there's more than 1,000 different ones. We have a research program underway right now that a few months from now I'll give you clear answers in terms of what we decipher out of that, and in particular Canadian implications out of that. Okay. Because of the 1,000 different court cases that I'm aware of, I think 13 were in Canada, and most of 13 were, anyway. So it's different cases on different topics. One part of the overall discussion is you won't find 1,000 cases focused on climate change and emissions leading to damage and that sort of train of thought and liability. You'll find 1,000 if you focus now on climate, and you talked about allowing someone to live in an area of danger, and wasn't it your responsibility to reduce that danger, and are you held liable beyond just the decision? Anyway, there are a number of different issues coming up. One of the areas that a little more has been written is in the area of professional liability. And if you have a professional and perhaps you're under contract and those hiring you say, don't worry about climate change, I'd like you to design this or build this, and I don't need you to have the extra cost of dealing with climate change. Well, as a professional, down the road, when someone else has that thing that you worked on and it goes and fails in a future kind of climate, and you say, well, I knew better, but I was paid not to know all of that, that won't hold up very well in court. And so professional liability, there's a greater sense that liability will be there, that you must use best science, best practices, best knowledge, including knowledge about climate change, as you are a professional doing your job, like an engineer, etc. So the liability questions, the attribution issues, it's a fascinating, evolving area that will be really important, and some of us are enjoying watching and trying to learn more about, and we've got a project on that right now.
So insurers insure risks and not certainties. So do you see a day coming when certain properties, certain assets will not be insurable because of climate change, because what became or what was a risk is now a certainty in certain areas of Canada? Are we at that stage? Do you ever see that?
So one of the challenges in how society chooses to manage these kinds of risks, climate-related, extreme weather type risks, as an economist who works on these issues, if you talk about new construction, new homes, new buildings, new infrastructure, where you are starting with a blank slate, the changes required to be resilient to today's weather and tomorrow's weather, and to be very responsible in terms of how you build something new. The extra cost is really small. It doesn't cost very much to be ready for tomorrow's weather. And you can look out pretty far, certainly the kind of expectation you might have for how long a house will stand up and whatever. For relatively little, you can make the new construction ready for tomorrow's weather. And I think that that's going to be an aggressive part of things we'll do in Canada and elsewhere. So the bigger challenge is that all of us live in existing homes. And to do those same improvements to something that's already been built is much harder. They're inside the walls and some of the structures. And to add what for a new construction is very small, for an existing is not small. It's a much bigger challenge. So where the risks grow over time as the climate and the frequency of extreme events start to occur is the risk to things that are older and designed for the old system. And it takes a while to replace our stock of buildings and infrastructure, generations to do that. So that's where the risk will pick up. And so when you are able to properly measure, here's what the risk of damage is, and the job of insurance is to pool that, and each participant should put into the risk pool something that reflects their part of the risk and their chance of taking funds out. So the older structures, if it's not cost effective to help them keep up with the climate, that will be a challenge. The reason why I'm not concerned about an alarming change here is that the climate is changing gradually, and that this is something that one event happens quickly and it's sudden and it's accidental and it happens on that particular day. But the overall risk of loss, it's not just happening in a short 5 to 10 year time frame. It's spread over decades, and slowly the risk will be rising for older structures where it's not cost effective to work on them, and the affordability of insurance. Some of those issues will start to build for those structures. And for those who just don't like loss, I'm one of these ones who drives very conservatively, and I try to look after my home, and my home is older, but I've got a lot of the new things in it. If you're willing to make the payments, you can even take older buildings and look after them. It's just not as clear savings or cost savings. It's a tougher sell, and you have to have that mindset that you really want to protect yourself. And the science is there. It can be done, but it's a little harder. So will the cost of insurance perhaps grow for some that don't keep up what they're doing? It will. For the next generation, there's the potential that insurance could become quite affordable, be part of perhaps some of the choices. Do you want new? Do you want old? And the role of insurance is to quantify all of this. Insurance is to look at the actual risk, try to help take that down to the individual property owner and say, your risk is this, and this is the fair price of transferring that risk over to an insurance company. At that fair price, an insurance company will be willing to take the risk.
A number of questions came forward from members. One, we talked about the frequency and intensity of extreme weather events. This member was very concerned about city infrastructure, the fact it's aging, we can't cope. And then they asked, is there another big thing beyond aging infrastructure? Is there a next big issue that we should see on the horizon? Or is the focus right now fixing for the next 10, 20 years aging infrastructure, bridges, roads, whatnot?
Yeah, aging infrastructure is huge, and there is a political commitment that is fairly strong in Canada to say the next generation of infrastructure will try to take into account climate change. Mm-hmm. And ICLR is working on codes and standards in a variety of different ways to institutionalize the scientific knowledge and say when you put in the sewer pipe, the size you would have normally used, let's put in one size bigger if you're looking out 25 years, so put in two sizes bigger if you're looking out 50 years. And so how to formally do that process, the Institute has given a tool to local governments, for example, to use the scientific measurements of intensity, duration, or frequency of rainfall in the city and adjust the measure that urban engineers are using and say, well, here's what the new number is when you bring in climate change. So we give that to all the cities in Canada free of charge. And so there is a process that is coming into effect for the next generation of infrastructure. And that takes time. But we are also talking about very significant public investments in the next generation of infrastructure. So there's several billions of dollars committed for infrastructure, and the tools about how to deal with them properly are coming forward. So that excites me. But the existing infrastructure, and there's a lot of communities now with systems that are beyond their expected life expectancy. They may or may not be replaced if the funds are available, and they should be replaced, and it's time to replace them. But will that happen fast enough?
Water mains and sinkholes you hear in the wintertime, it's like now it's expected. It used to be 10 years ago, it was like, wow, big sinkhole downtown. But
yeah, the quality of our infrastructure in particular, our buried underground infrastructure that supports sewers and the risk of basement flooding is related to that. The out-of-sight infrastructure that's easy to try to ignore. Our big push on that was in the 60s and 70s, and the losses related to that were the lowest in the 60s and 70s because we put in so much new systems. And it was a very exciting period.
They run their course after 40, 50 years, is that?
And they're all a little bit different.
Okay.
Depends on how it was put in place and how it was done. But they have, as engineers, I'm an economist, not an engineer, there is a life expectancy of each of these systems. And so there is a sense in some cases they're getting old. There are some that are 100 years old, they've been taken care of, they've been, various things have been done along the way, so they're still working really well. So it's not just age, but it's having the knowledge to make sure you do it right. You specifically, if you let me just go to an aside, a different issue, you sort of open the door, what's an emerging issue? One of the things that I'm looking forward to doing a lot of work on over the next while is on the issue of disclosure. And there has been a remarkable change with Mark Carney, the former Bank of Canada head, and now with the governor, now with the Bank of England, has led a global discussion focused on the international insurance, banking, and financial sector that will come to the Canadian insurance industry soon. And this is talking about what companies should disclose in their financial statements in terms of telling people, here's what we do, here's what's happening with our company. And the earlier discussion on this topic, the question being asked of companies was, would you tell me about what your company is doing in terms of your financial health, but also what impact you're having on the environment? Tell me if you're emitting greenhouse gases, and are you doing a lot of it or not very much? And when those questions started to emerge a number of years ago, generally for the insurance industry and the Canadian insurance industry, the answer was, yeah, we admit a little bit, but not very much. We're certainly not in the business of energy production or mining or whatever. We have some buildings and we have to keep them warm and things, but our emissions are pretty small, actually. So when the questions were related about finance and emissions, we didn't have that much extra to say. The question has changed. And there's this global push, and Carney has sort of been really important in terms of changing how we see this. And the question is a little bit less, what are companies' impact on the environment? And now the question being asked, what might the environment do to the company? And that showed up quite a bit last year when Harvey was moving toward Houston and when Irma was moving across Florida. And a number of U.S. insurers were being asked, what might the damage be tomorrow? And do you have enough money to pay for that? And investors were looking to find out, do I want to keep my investment with you or should I move it somewhere else? And this regulatory and investor focus to increasingly challenge companies, and in particular insurers and banks, and ask, can you tell me what the environment, what storms impacts might be on you? And can you make that part of your regular disclosure? That's a new emerging area that I think will build over the next 3 years. And I think that it'll be quite challenging for insurers to figure out what it is that we know how to disclose, that we can confidently tell people about how the environment might have an impact on us. It is fairly material for the property insurance industry. This is not like us saying we don't do many emissions, which is true, But we do have the potential that these large events can have a big impact on our performance. And so how do we start to include that in what we might have investors expect us to disclose? And not only is this coming a bit from the regulatory community, but there's a lot more investors starting to ask these questions, the large pension plans and others. And it's a newer issue. It'll take a number of years before this all settles down and we figure out. But I think disclosure will evolve into a fairly important issue for the insurance industry thinking about climate change.
Okay. A member asked about the low carbon strategy in Canada and how are we placed worldwide. Do you have a comment on that?
Yeah, so the emissions per person in Canada are very high relative to the rest of the world. And the commitments made recently by the Government of Canada and made by a number of provincial governments about where our emissions will be going into the future are fairly ambitious, that we were talking about a large reduction in our emissions going forward. Many of the commitments are far enough out that it's hard to tell whether we're on path, whether we're on track for that. And so it will be a real challenge to see how our commitments compare to others. The global discussion had usually particularly focused on Canada for failing to make progress 10 years ago and 20 years ago, and we were losing ground and we were getting further behind. And recently the international discussions have been praising Canada about strong commitments going forward, that we aspire to do a lot. But the challenge is, will we actually be successful in achieving that? And it's just too early to tell. And as an economist, I mean, one of the goals that I know can be effective, you start putting on carbon taxes or bring in trading schemes. These are all variations of tools that were used to reduce smoking and reduce a number of other things that society thought were inappropriate. Then you bring in a tax and that changes behavior. But beyond just changing some of the incentives, which is part of the Canadian discussion now, and we'll see if that amps up over time, there is also the importance of the technology and what role is our government's playing to try to encourage the use of new technology. As you mentioned earlier, I've been driving an electric car for quite a long time now. And the fact that the Government of Canada and the Province of Ontario gave an incentive, made it more affordable for me to buy the car that I have. And I can't afford a Tesla, but I have my little Nissan Leaf, and it was now more affordable for me to quietly drive around. And so having the government get involved in putting together strategies like they have in Quebec and Ontario and BC about now I can drive and plug my car in because there's a place to fuel up, that it makes it more attractive to, again, change how we behave and how we choose to interact. So we'll see how aggressive we come. But generally, the Canadian government was being criticized internationally for losing ground and having a lot of emissions. And we're getting more praise now that we have goals to try to address this, but it's early to tell how well we'll do and whether we'll meet those goals.
Talking about Elon Musk, he's making flamethrowers more affordable, which is really nice to see. We have time for maybe one more question, and that's, do you foresee a normal cooling of the planet in the future? That came forward from a member. Is there a way to dial it back, these efforts to combat climate change, global warming? Can we ever turn the temperature down, or are we kind of like, this is the new normal and it goes the best we can have or expect right now, a steady state, that this is as good as it gets? What would be your answer to that?
One of the challenges of the climate science is that there are many different factors that come together, and you have all this noise, and to truly understand the root causes, some of the trends going on, you have to try to pull some of that noise out. Anytime a large volcano erupts, that puts a lot of elements into the atmosphere. The sun isn't able to get through, and globally you get a cooling. And we've had several events, not too long ago in Iceland, where the travel between Europe and North America was disrupted because of a large eruption. So you have these temporary events that can disrupt trends and make it hard to see where we're going. You have these very, very long-term trends where we move into an ice age, we move out of an ice age, and this is a natural trend. This is, again, the wobble of the Earth and the distance to the sun and all of these issues that over very long periods of time, like 25 million years, we have change that can be meaningful enough that you suddenly have all of Canada completely covered in ice because we're now further away from the sun and the planet's on more of an angle. And so these shifts between cooling and warming on the long term are part of these trends that have not changed, and they're still part of the overall system. But within the time frame that we are working within. So if you have companies with a 10-year plan, if you have companies with we have cities in Canada that have a 100-year strategy for Vancouver and how they want to plan. It's unequivocal what we are anticipating based on the best available science right now. We will have warming over the time frames that anybody that I'm aware of is actually managing to. And the sense that there would be any of these natural events that would bring any kind of relief in this time period is just not going to happen. And a little bit uncomfortable to me is that there has started to be more open discussion of what's called climate engineering. And this is not just telling people stop using carbon and switch over to electric cars or solar electric power generation and hydropower and other greener sources. But this is saying, could we actually intervene and try to stop this process? Could we purposefully put things up in the atmosphere to block some of the sunlight coming through? And this sort of science has been thought about for a long period of time, but it wasn't part of mainstream discussion saying we really have to seriously think about these alternatives. And increasingly, we are saying that the extent in a foreseeable future of extreme climate change is such that we need to really know what these choices are and how we might actually engineer and try to change society, which is a little uncomfortable. But back to where I'm coming from, I'm still the glass is half full. I see a lot of very positive things. The world definitely sees the insurance industry as on the leading edge in terms of acknowledging that the climate is changing, acting just to do its job, acting to say, hey, this risk has increased, so we have to change our pricing. That's what we need to do. We have to invest in science and supporting things like the Institute for Catastrophic Loss Reduction for more than 20 years. When 20 years ago this was hard to talk about, our industry started actually doing research on these topics. Our industry is seen as a leader in Canada and elsewhere, and the industry is definitely seen as a group presenting ideas and solutions on parts, in particular how to adapt and how to better design buildings and structures and understand how to cope with the kind of changes that are happening, whatever they might prove to be. There's more science going to be available because of what our industry knows and is working on. So although the climate change discussion is very difficult, I've been proud to go and participate in those discussions for a long period of time, to represent the insurance industry, to talk about how to best cope with these issues and how to best deal with them. So I see the overall dialogue as one that I'm excited by, despite the challenges that exist.
Naysayers. That's probably a pretty good point to conclude our discussion today. I want to thank Paul Kovacs for being here, for being our guest speaker. Paul, again, is President and CEO of PACICC. He is the founder and Executive Director of the Institute for Catastrophic Loss Reduction. You're going to see a copy of this webinar on our website next week, on the PACICC website. You're going to receive a satisfaction survey notice tomorrow. We hope that you respond to that to help make our webinars better in future. We hope you enjoyed the format for this webinar. Our next event is the Risk Officers Forum meeting on April 5th. Don't miss that. We're going to have Penny Lee, OSFI Senior Director of P&C Insurance Group, the insurance supervision sector, will update us. We're about 6 months beyond their annual risk management seminar, so you're going to want to be there for an update on industry risk issues, registration form to follow shortly. Our next Emerging Risks webinar is Wednesday, May 16th. We're always trying to be topical and current here. So we're looking at marijuana legalization, the implications for PNC Insurance. We have Brenda Wells, Director of the Risk Management and Insurance Program at East Carolina University, coming to speak. And again, it'll be this talk show format. Very interesting. Brenda's also a stand-up comedian, so I don't know if she's going to be bringing her jokes with her, but it should be a very lively performance. I want to thank our friends at EventStream for technical support behind today's broadcast. This concludes today's webinar. We look forward to having you join us for future sessions. Thanks for tuning us in, and goodbye for now.